when the China-India border tensions were kind of at their peak, there were internet users suggesting that foreign ministry officials were being weak and traitors and weren't standing up for the motherland. And so there's still pressure on that front. But I think a lot of it has kind of been solved by, firstly, Xi Jinping's move toward nationalism and the tone that that's helped set for China's foreign relations, but then also the foreign ministry's embrace of wolf warrior diplomacy and just how popular that seems to have been, from T-shirts with Yang Jiechi's nationalist slogans on them, through to viral clips and fan sites for senior Chinese diplomats.
China Civilian Army, The Making of Wolf Warrior Diplomacy, Part 2, book written by Peter Martin of Bloomberg, co-hosting with me today, Jason Zhou, a current Schwartzman scholar. We ended it right on the cusp of Nixon going to China. And I think, we don't necessarily have to do the whole narrative here, but I think it was really interesting. At the end of last show, we ended with the experience of Chinese diplomats as they're sort of exploring the developing world, because that's where most of the folks in the 50s and 60s ended up being posted to. But as we turn into the early 1970s, then folks started to get sent to the U.S., to Canada. You get folks going to graduate school at LSE and in the U.S. There was this fantastic piece of writing you had to kick off a chapter, talking about some Chinese diplomats who showed up in New York in 1971. What first struck many of them was the colors on clothing, on shop fronts, and on neon signs. They saw a world that seemed physically and even morally jarring compared to the monochrome uniformity of communist Beijing. What was that experience like for these young diplomats venturing out of China in a new era, where relations between Beijing and the Western world seemed to be changing?
Yeah, I think it was really exciting for a lot of them. As you said, there were kind of moral universes and kind of aesthetic universes that they'd never been able to explore before. And so they were kind of on this amazing learning streak and taking information from all around them and from the New York Times and listening to the radio and those kind of things. But it was also a pretty tense experience for them, I think. You got to remember that the Cultural Revolution was still going on in Beijing, and they were on the front lines of, what was ostensibly China's ideological foe, the United States. And they had to deal with, how do I navigate this new environment and keep myself safe at the same time?
Yeah. The sort of worldviews clashing, I think, was captured best in your anecdote about the diplomats who showed up in Canada in 1970, where basically you tell this story that they sort of ventured out to see an old folks' home, and the diplomats were convinced it was a Potemkin village. And then the Canadians were like, you can just drive anywhere you want and you'll see like another suburb which looks exactly like this suburb.
Right.
And, they say, later we came to understand that these were old people's homes, just like this in every city across Canada, and that supply was sufficient to meet local needs. I can't imagine growing up through the Great Famine and Cultural Revolution and all of a sudden having your mind blown by, it's like going to Mars and seeing like alien technology, I imagine.
Totally. No, it would have been completely bewildering. And I think, they all had participated in hosting foreign governments and foreign dignitaries in Beijing, where there are these incredibly elaborate kind of setups for foreign visitors arriving. Everything is choreographed. The city is cleaned up. It was like that in the 70s. It's like it now. Just this incredible degree of precision. And it was unthinkable to them that other foreign countries wouldn't do the same when Chinese officials visited.
All right, why don't you take us to the death of Mao?
So I guess there was this period of kind of extended political uncertainty where China diplomatically started to re-engage with the world, but the future trajectory of the country was incredibly unclear. The Gang of Four was still running things in Beijing even after Mao Zedong died, and it wasn't at all clear what was going to happen. I think the kind of the last thing on people's minds, including Chinese diplomats, was the idea that the country was about to embark on 3-4 decades of sustained economic reform, and that Deng Xiaoping, who had been kind of repeatedly sidelined from the leadership of Chinese politics, would come back to power. But as Chinese diplomats around the world kind of tried to piece together what was going on in Beijing, listening to BBC News broadcasts, clipping bits of foreign newspapers up on the wall, they sort of gradually came to realize that actually the time of the Gang of Four was over. The short-lived leadership of Hua Guofeng came and went relatively quickly, and eventually Deng Xiaoping kind of emerged as the paramount leader. And of course, we know that he would set China off on this incredible new trajectory, experimenting with capitalism.
Deng's sort of openness to foreign ideas, I think, is captured in a really fascinating way by his trip to America, where, not only does he sort of wear a Stetson and go to barbecues, but also there was this fascinating detail that you had, which I'd love to hear the backstory on, if there is one, of him wanting to see an American SOE. I cannot imagine what the sort of State Department bureaucrats handling that request thought of. Eventually, they took him to the U.S. Mint. Is there any? Did you dig into this at all? Like, what was going on there? Were there other candidates for other SOEs?
I don't know the U.S. side of the story. I think that I would have to check. I think that came from Huang Hua's memoir, where he talks about this desire that Deng had to kind of see both sides of the U.S., the state-owned side and the capitalist side. And, clearly that was a pretty difficult order for them to fulfill. But I've never heard the U.S. side. I'd love to hear it.
So if anyone wants to dig into those Carter administration archives or lives in Atlanta, let me know and I will run that article on China Talk. Chinese diplomats in the 1980s, it must have been one real head trip. The life was changing pretty dramatically domestically in China, but also, you had the foreign ministry, which had to adapt to the times as well.
Yeah, so the foreign ministry underwent this kind of, like the rest of the Chinese bureaucracy, this kind of wholesale modernization effort. Really kind of boring but crucial bureaucratic stuff, like how cadres evaluated for their performance. Should it be based solely on ideology, or should it be based on some other metric of professionalism? How are they going to be trained? When are they going to retire? All of these kind of things that, like, added together create a professional bureaucracy that works effectively and seems professional to the outside world. China kind of started to work on those in the 80s. And I guess there was this process that was a little bit similar to, in the 50s, that the Chinese foreign ministry had very consciously modeled itself on the Soviet diplomatic system and tried to learn lessons from the way that the Soviet Union did things. I guess there was a bit of a parallel process going on in the 80s. I talked to officials who had worked on the State Department China desk in that period, and Chinese diplomats would come in with the most basic questions like, how does your social security system work? And would just start piecing together bits of information about how the US government apparatus functioned. And so they kind of did the same thing to the US in the 80s that they had done to the Soviet Union in the 50s.
So what bits do you think ended up getting absorbed?
It's a good question. I mean, even more recently, there was a series of sort of reforms that took place to China's foreign ministry and especially its embassies in 2017, where the role of ambassadors was strengthened and Chinese ambassadors were given kind of reporting responsibilities for representatives of all different Chinese ministries in the embassy, whether that's agriculture or Ministry of Commerce or whatever. And that reform, I think, was quite explicitly modeled on the way that US ambassadors oversee the duties of various different pieces of the bureaucracy within US embassies. So I guess that that learning process, despite all of the ideological confrontation between the two countries now, that learning process has never really stopped.
So one other interesting thing that you recount from this era is that actually Xi Jinping's former father-in-law, who was stationed in London, had a lot of somewhat favorable things to say about capitalism and observed a lot of interesting things, especially during, for instance, the Thatcher era in the UK. Do you have any sense for to what extent those views might have made its way to Xi, and to what extent, what sort of relations Xi had with his father-in-law?
Yeah, I don't know any detail about that relationship. There might be some people out there who know more than me. there's no indication that it was tense or difficult, but I guess that, Xi's father kind of outranked Kehua, the ambassador we're talking about, inside the Chinese system. And I don't know whether they discussed Kerr's views on capitalism and democracy, but certainly, as you both know, those were very much fashionable topics of kind of for intellectually curious people in 1980s China and elite circles. And I'm sure that those same ideas came across kind of Xi's inbox. I don't know whether the two of them ever exchanged thoughts explicitly, though.
It's so interesting to think about as like a historical nugget.
Yeah, I mean, I remember researching it and thinking that Kerr was just the most, like one of the most extraordinary figures I'd read about. He was so open-minded and curious, and able just to reconsider the most basic assumptions that he had about how the world worked. And I was so impressed by him, and kind of spent a long time getting as much detail out of his memoir as I could. And it wasn't until kind of sometime later that I thought, oh, yeah, wasn't Xi Jinping's first father-in-law an ambassador in London? And then it kind of clicked and all came together that, oh, wow, that's him. But I thought he was fascinating even before I was, I kind of made that link.
I think we know the answer. The first wife was too liberal.
Yeah, I mean, she was certainly too liberal in the sense that she wanted to live in the United Kingdom, and that wasn't going to work out for Xi Jinping, who already had his eyes on the path to power in Beijing.
So let's talk about a few other sort of leading lights of the past 30 years of Chinese diplomacy. Chen Qichen, what do you think we can learn from his story? And maybe let's stop before Tiananmen.
I think one of the interesting things about Chen is, because he was a Soviet expert, he, on a personal level, kind of went through the same process of like falling in love with the Soviet Union and then slowly falling out of love with it that China's political system went through writ large. So he started off, I think, in the 1950s as a junior diplomat in Moscow. He returned a couple of times later on in his career and was kind of bewildered to find that this plate, which was supposed to represent the future of humanity, was now kind of looking a little bit creaky and unimpressive. And he started to think, how does this fit in with my ideological beliefs and all of the stuff that I was taught about the Soviet Union? He also noticed that, I think lots of people enjoy kind of telling Soviet jokes as they gripe about the world. And he noticed that like Soviet citizens complained an awful lot. And he was struck by that too. So, he kind of had this like personal experience of seeing the Soviet Union cut down to size in his own eyes, which I think very much informed his ability to be such an open-minded, foreign minister.
Yeah. So let's come to June 4th, which is a really interesting dynamic for a few reasons. First off, it was clear that there were a lot of liberals in the foreign ministry, and I think even at some point they were protesting with the students in the streets. But then after Tiananmen, their job is to, slowly build China back from the diplomatic isolation, which Tiananmen Square engendered. So, one of the puzzles I have thinking back on this history is just how quickly it happened. That China was able to reconcile the world to, the continued leadership of the folks who perpetrated Tiananmen Square. So what was going on there, and how was the foreign ministry able to finesse what was at the time seemed like a pretty tall order?
Yeah, I think it was an incredible struggle for a lot of people in the ministry, both in terms of just it was an exceptionally hard sell to tell the world that China's economic opening up was going to continue even after this very violent crackdown in Beijing, but also in terms of kind of on a more personal level, like this just jarring experience of, especially for young diplomats, of thinking that your country was heading in one direction and was kind of on the right side of history, and then finding out that you now lived in a pariah state which was being shunned by the world, and and represented a political system that had made a very, very different set of choices. So I think it was really tough. There was a lot of confusion at the beginning. And I guess in those circumstances, Chinese diplomats did what they always do when they're not quite sure of the right response, which was to be really prickly and kind of shout down foreign counterparts and tell them not to interfere in China's business. But I think, longer term, Tian Chi-chen, who was heading up the ministry, but also China's top leaders, realized that the country needed a more compelling vision for its international role if it was going to come back from this. And that involved, of course, continuing after a tricky political process, continuing economic reform in Beijing, trying to host the Olympics to kind of boost Chinese soft power, making promises about improvements to its human rights record. We can debate how sincere those promises were. And, of course, engaging in kind of friendship diplomacy on its periphery and trying to kind of slowly, one by one, pick off countries which had sanctioned it or shunned it in the aftermath.
I mean, it's really interesting because I think you close the book with the sort of hint that we may be going back to more of a cultural revolution era style of diplomacy. But it's interesting thinking back to the response to Tiananmen and it being almost like the apotheosis of the reforms which happened post-Mao. And I don't think a sort of Mao era diplomatic corps would have been able to ultimately pull off the successes that you saw from the Chinese Foreign Ministry over the course of the 90s.
I think it's also especially remarkable given that, I think as you know in the book, a bunch of Chinese diplomats or a bunch of folks from the Chinese embassies actually defected right after Tiananmen. And it wouldn't be surprising if the leadership took that as a sort of indication of the unreliability of the foreign ministry. So the ability of Chiang to really hold together the ministry and still be able to do these creative maneuvers is pretty impressive.
Yeah, I think so too. But I think it really comes down to that kind of core value of the Chinese foreign ministry, which is discipline and the ability to follow orders. And as we know, when the leadership decides that it wants to push hard on ideology or promote the cult of personality at home, the foreign ministry will kind of move very, very quickly in that direction, whether it's in the 60s or now under Xi Jinping, often with pretty disastrous consequences for China's international reputation. But when the leadership decides that it wants to win over others and charm the world like it did in the 50s or the 90s, Chinese diplomats can work toward that objective with incredible professionalism. So the system, I think, compared with the US, is just much, much more responsive to what the leadership wants. If you think about the tone that Donald Trump and even to some extent Secretary of State Mike Pompeo set for the State Department, I don't think that they felt that bureaucracy was as responsive to what they wanted. It was as responsive as they would have hoped. And, I guess that's because US Foreign Service officers swear an oath of loyalty to a notion of the United States, which is much, and the US government, which is much, much broader than any single political party or leader. And that's not really true of any part of the Chinese government apparatus. It very much functions to work toward the whims of the Communist Party.
So, Pete, since you brought up the comparison, you were reporting out of Beijing for a while. You've spent the past year plus now in Washington covering the Pentagon, intelligence community, and moonlighting as a State Department correspondent. What is the experience like as a journalist? How does it sort of compare sitting in, foreign ministry briefings, being yelled at versus being yelled at, presumably by American officials who are upset with one story or another?
Yeah, there's a lot less yelling, I guess, is the kind of obvious starting point. And, the information environment is so much more open.
You showed up in the Biden era.
Well, I don't know. I actually hear from colleagues that Trump officials, despite the kind of public anti-media bluster, were very, very talkative in private. And of course, you can see from just the kind of public record of reporting on the administration that it was very, very leaky. I think that the Biden folks are a little bit more, or a lot more disciplined about the way that they deal with the media. and kind of leaks as such are a little bit and harder to come by. But in comparison with Beijing, it's kind of night and day. You know, Washington's information environment is incredibly open. You know, just by going to think tank meetings and having coffees with people, you pick up just this massive amount of information. And then if your expectations are those of like a political reporter based in China, it seems like you're kind of struggling to deal with a deluge of facts coming your way rather than kind of feeding off scraps in the way that you are in the Chinese political system. I can elaborate a little bit more. I don't know what.
Yeah. Let's keep going. I want to do more on this theme. Where do you want to take it, Pete?
I mean, I guess that the part of my beat now, which is most similar to reporting on Chinese politics, is the CIA part. And in some ways, but maybe because I'm used to reporting on China, that's where I feel most at home. It's much easier to talk to the CIA than it is most parts of the Chinese government. And their media relations folks are very friendly. But what the big thing I think that they have in common is that, I can't remember who it was that said this about Chinese politics. I wish I could. But that reporting on Chinese politics is like trying to review a play when you can't see any of the actors. All you can see is the audience response. So you're kind of chasing after these like secondary images of what's happening. And that's definitely true of the Chinese Communist Party. So you're talking to foreign business people, foreign diplomats, Chinese think tankers, Chinese scholars, a lot of the time, reading official media accounts and trying to kind of decipher what these various shadows tell you about what's really happening under the surface. And reporting on the CIA is a little bit like that. You know, you're kind of into this world of former officials, kind of intelligence intellectuals, that kind of thing, and slowly trying to piece together, okay, all of these people are saying this thing. I think that's what's happening, inside the agency right now. And then you try and confirm it with current people. But that's the most comparable part. And for that reason, that's kind of what I've gravitated toward in Washington too.
Yeah. So one of your more remarkable pieces of late on the intelligence beat were all these Biden appointed officials complaining to you that the CIA wasn't telling them enough about China, and they didn't understand the country. Like, what's going on there? Does the CIA not have people who read 100 memoirs of foreign ministry officials or something?
I'm sure they have much better things to do with their time. Yeah, I mean, I think it reflects, a few different things. First, Beijing has gone really good at counterintelligence and just kind of rooting out those CIA networks. And the New York Times kind of documented that really nicely in a big 2017 piece that they had on the agency's network being taken down. And then I think there are some kind of peculiarities to Xi Jinping's China, which have made, a tough job even tougher. The ubiquity of surveillance technology makes meeting sources and keeping anything private incredibly difficult. And then, Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign means that, those briefcases full of cash, which are so useful in recruiting assets, are much more closely monitored than they would have been 10 or 15 years ago. That, and of course, the fact that, Xi Jinping has kind of consolidated power so effectively means that instead of looking at the inner circles of 7 or even 9 Politburo Standing Committee members, you're kind of trying to get into the very small inner circle of one person who is relatively isolated and incredibly closely guarded. Kind of all of those things have come together to make human intelligence gathering incredibly difficult in China.
Human intelligence gathering, those are sort of like the cheat codes, but like eating your peas and vegetables is what it seems like Yang Jiechi does every day reading the New York Times. I don't think there are many people in the U.S. government who open Renmin Herbao every day. There's been a push in Congress to sort of fund more open source China research. Apparently, the CIA is like restructuring to create a new China initiative because I guess they didn't have one beforehand or something. Do you have a take on sort of like to what extent the U.S. intelligence community is trying to adapt and, you know, not only just try to like hack stuff, but also just read what's out there and maybe get a little better at sort of understanding the audience to the play of Chinese politics?
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely pushing harder toward using more open source material. I'm sure if representatives of the various agencies were here, they would say accurately that they've had people reading the People's Daily for many, many decades. But of course, the obvious retort is, well, why so few? And, you know, that they're investing in staffing off on Mandarin speakers, which has always been something difficult for them. And it's a process which is made, kind of doubly difficult by the complexities of getting a security clearance, which mean that if you spent very much time on the ground in China or have family ties to the country, it can be quite difficult to get through that process. So, you know, traditionally, it's kind of had to train up people from scratch. And that's made open source collection more difficult. And there's just the resourcing constraints, you know, the long-term focus on the greater Middle East and the conflicts going on there and the post 9/11 threats to homeland security have just meant that China has not been prioritized in the way that perhaps it should have been. And that's something that's been acknowledged pretty frankly, in truth, by, you know, Bill Burns, the new director of the CIA, and various other people at the top of the Biden administration, and they're trying to turn it around, but it's a slow process, and it's a very, very hard target under Xi Jinping.
Coming back to going down our list of our favorite modern Chinese foreign ministry officials. So Pete, Wang Yi, what has he been up to? How did he get to the position he's in today? And what's it like taking a plane ride with him and some other Politburo members flying off to Geneva or Washington, D.C.?
Unfortunately, Wang Yi doesn't take any foreign press with him on overseas trips, so I can only speculate from kind of great distance. I think that just like on the U.S. Secretary of State's plane, there's a chance if you know when Wang flies with Xi, there's a chance of FaceTime with the top leader there that's maybe very, very difficult to come by in Beijing. And there's also a little bit of downtime and bonding. And so I heard this anecdote about Xi and Wang drinking Maotai together on the plane, which I think is probably true. By all accounts, Xi Jinping enjoys Maotai on many occasions. And it makes sense to me that Wang would have managed to work himself into one of those.
But apparently he doesn't like Desmond Shum enough to drink with him. That was a detail in Red Roulette that like she wouldn't drink around him. I love someone telling you that not only did they drink a lot together, but they would drink more than the other officials. So I wonder if there's like a Mienza thing going on where all the other officials feel like they have to, after 2 shots, be like, oh, I can't do it anymore just to make Xi look good. Or if these guys are actually really killing themselves and stepping up to the, you know, alcoholic plate.
I don't know about Wang Yi. My impression is that Xi Jinping can really take his liquor, but
so earlier this year, Kirk Campbell, who's the sort of top U.S. official on the Indo-Pacific area, said that Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi are not within, I think, 100 miles or something of Xi Jinping's inner circle. I'm curious to what extent you agree with that statement, especially given some of the research and anecdotes you relayed about Wang Yi and Xi's relationship. How close do you actually think they are? And if they aren't that close, where do you think like Xi is getting his foreign policy advice from? Like who are there like closer confidants that they know?
Kirk Campbell, in a subsequent event, I can't remember if he used the words "I'm sorry," but he kind of semi-retracted that statement. I think it's a little bit off. I think that it's accurate in the sense that both Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi are career Chinese diplomats, and they're never going to have the same standing inside the system as someone who has come up on a kind of purely political track inside the Communist Party. And neither of them are really elite political players in the sense that I suspect they're not particularly involved in making deals over who gets to govern what province or what happens to the Chinese economy. they are both very much in this kind of diplomatic lane, and I suspect are kind of made to stay there. So in that sense, it's true that they're not especially close to the inner circle. I think the place where it's probably off is that both of them, as far as I understand, do have Xi Jinping's ear on foreign policy issues. I've heard accounts of other officials being kind of ushered out of the room when Xi wants to have a one-on-one with a foreign counterpart, and Yang being asked to stay behind and to kind of advise Xi and listen in on the details of those conversations. And that to me does suggest that Xi recognizes his value kind of at least as an advisor and as someone who understands the outside world. Also, the simple fact that he was promoted to the Politburo. I mean, I think that shows that Xi Jinping in general thinks that foreign policy is important and that it's very important to have a US expert at that kind of very high level. And it sort of signals that Yang qualifies. And I think the same thing when it comes to Wang Yi on diplomacy in general, but then especially on Asia and Japan, where his kind of primary expertise lies. So they kind of have this functional role that's very important and does involve some real closeness to Xi, but they're not sitting down in the inner sanctums of elite politics, if that makes sense.
It's interesting thinking about Yang Jiechi and the fact that on the one hand, he has to walk around and call Xi's speeches precious spiritual resources, but these are probably the most worldly folks in the Politburo. They're the ones who spent time abroad and have, been reading the New York Times for a while. I'm curious, Pete, connecting this to your sort of closing anecdote in the book about this young diplomat who you met in 2017, who asked you with who sort of very naively asks you if Tiananmen was an American plot. So what extent these folks believe all of this? Because, there is this sort of discipline and the towing the party line aspect of these folks. But I mean, is there a way to sort of peer in the heart in the heart of hearts of any of these junior as well as more senior folks who've sort of seen history over the decades?
It's really difficult to decipher what's I'm just looking up the name of a book title actually, which I wanted to cite. It's tough to kind of pick apart how much of that is accurate and true to what they think, and then how much is just them towing the line for foreigners. And I think it's a mixture of the two, and the kind of closest way that I can think of it is listening to I'm a British person in DC, and so the US foreign policy rhetoric in a slightly different way to how an American might view it, and listening to American politicians simultaneously talk about America as a chosen nation and a special nation which stands above others and is exceptional, but then also listening to them acknowledge shortcomings and difficulties and allegations of torture and invading Iraq in 2003 and all of these kind of things. And I think it is possible for them to hold these kind of two sometimes contradictory images in their head at the same time, and to talk about both sincerely, even if they can't completely square those circles. And I think for Chinese officials, the circle that they need to square is probably bigger, and it's harder to square. And those two images of the way that they talk about themselves in propaganda and the way that he works in China, probably that gulf is much, much bigger than it would be in the case of the United States. But I think that the kind of the challenge of holding two things in your head simultaneously and still being able to function is kind of common across the two. And I don't see any reason to sort of doubt their sincerity when they talk about these things.
So you have this line with John Kerry when he talks to Wang Yi. And at one point, he kind of freelances and tells him, look, you should really get to know the Dalai Lama. He's not that bad a guy after you have a few cokes with him. And Wang Yi immediately flips from sort of open-minded, liberal, whatever. This is still 2013, 2014 to this guy is a wolf in sheep's clothing. You're crazy. No, he's horrible and terrible. It's almost like it doesn't matter whether in Wang Yi's heart of hearts he thinks China should relate to Tibetan leadership and rule Tibet in a different way, right? Because like it's been decided, he's not going to change it, and his job is to spread the gospel to the rest of the world. And that sort of cognitive dissonance is like, I think, almost easier to reconcile if you live in a system where it's so obvious what you have to do, right? Like where there is a party line and you have to toe it, and you can always fall back on that party line, right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the fact that Young's, the way that he sort of acts in those situations is performative is pretty nicely demonstrated by the sheer consistency of the language that he employs over time, and the fact that the Dalai Lama is a clown, he's a wolf in sheep's clothing. These are not Yang Jiechi idiosyncratic phrases. They are stock foreign ministry phrases which all officials will fall back on when they need to. And Yang delivers the lines with like a special passion and gusto, but I think that he's very much falling back on a political safe space when he does that. And there's probably a pretty strong degree of sincerity there, but he kind of works it out rhetorically in a way that is very much sanctioned by the system.
Yeah, it comes back to an anecdote you had earlier when you interviewed some old professors of Chinese students back in the 70s and talking about how they had such a hard time, like initially processing like open-ended questions with the teacher not kind of giving you the answer and the line, and how that was a really big learning experience for them. And it's interesting thinking about how these are the same people who like were being pushed at the Kennedy School or whatever to sort of think in that way, but their job nowadays, at least in their outward facing roles, is not to do that sort of grappling and negotiation with foreign officials as much as it is to sort of be part of the civilian army.
Both Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi are nearing 10 years at their current positions. Wang Yi as foreign minister, Yang Jiechi as director or secretary general or whatever of the Central Foreign Affairs Commission. It seems Yang Jiechi will probably have to retire, I think, given his age. Do you have any thoughts on who are likely to succeed them? Do you think Wang will just take up Yang's current role? Will have just a new foreign minister, or do you have any thoughts on sort of possible changes in foreign minister leadership going into the 20th Party Congress next year?
I mean, obviously, I have no idea what's going to happen, but that shouldn't stop me trying to answer the question. One person who's spoken about a lot is Lo Yicheng, who is one of the vice foreign ministers and has kind of shown up in a variety of settings that suggest that he might be poised to take over from Wang as foreign minister at some point. I don't know. Like the 5 years ago, I remember there was a lot of speculation that Song Tao from the International Liaison Department was going to replace Wang Yi. That didn't happen. So you never want to trust that kind of Beijing rumor mill too much. But I think there's a lot of focus on Le as someone who might take over. And you can see it just kind of from his he's kind of being teed up for a lot of high profile media appearances at home and abroad. He's making very wide-ranging speeches on Chinese foreign policy. So there does seem to be this indication that he's being prepared for some kind of high-level role, and perhaps that will be foreign minister, perhaps it's something else.
And do you think that we're going to see any sort of larger changes in culture at the foreign ministry, given that we're moving a bit away, changing generations a little bit from the generation that really experienced a lot of the hardships of the Cultural Revolution, etc., to a generation that maybe came of age a bit later during the reform and opening period? Do you think that will affect much, or do you think that they will still have to hew so closely to party line, etc., that it won't have as much?
So I think that one of the really striking things about the foreign ministry is this consistency in its culture from 49 all the way through till today, which is kind of incredible when you think about the changes that China has gone through during that time. The idea that this one institution could maintain such a similar approach in the way that it conducts itself. And I think, the reason for that is that this kind of civilian army model is very well suited to conducting diplomacy in a system with the kind of peculiar expectations and limitations that the Chinese Communist Party places on the conduct of foreign policy. I don't really expect that to change. I think it's very well suited to China. It held up during the period of, international communism. It held up during the reform and opening era. And one of the things that, Wang Yi, when he became foreign minister and had to deal with this kind of new role that China was taking on in the wake of the global financial crisis, this new leader, Xi Jinping, who had these startling new ambitions for China and the world, Wang, in his internal speeches, went back again and again to this theme of we work like the People's Liberation Army in civilian clothing. So just because it's been so successful and so useful in so many periods, I don't really see that aspect of it changing. But I think maybe some of the kind of cultural assumptions of Chinese diplomats will change along the way a little bit. And I guess, we've already started to see that, but we will now have increasingly generations of Chinese diplomats who have only ever known China as a strong power and have only ever known the era of reform and opening and then the era of Xi Jinping, haven't seen China at its weakest, haven't seen the dangers of the Cultural Revolution, only kind of know about them secondhand. You've got to think on some level that will have an impact. I remember talking to a pretty young diplomat in Beijing and asking him, what does it feel like? And this guy would be, I'm in my mid-30s, he's probably about the same age as me, maybe a little younger, but like, what is it room with foreign counterparts? And, does it feel good to come from a country that's becoming more and more powerful? And the person said, oh yeah, it feels great. When I first started here, we always felt like other countries didn't respect China and you could feel that they kind of looked down on you. But now when we walk into the room, you can feel the mood change and they know that we're a powerful country and they have to listen to us. And so I would think that those kind of experiences would just kind of amplify this existing trend towards kind of assertiveness and confidence on the part of Chinese officials. But, we'll have to see.
Hi, folks. This is Callum Quinn, China Talks editor. I'm currently in London and I'm interested in hosting a meetup for China Talk listeners on the evening of February 24th at a as yet undetermined location somewhere near King's Cross Station. If you're interested in joining, the Eventbrite link is in the show notes and I really hope to see some of you there.
Another new dynamic, of course, over the past 30 years is social media and the ability for the Chinese state to kind of drive the discussion, at least on foreign policy, I think was pretty consistent. You didn't have sort of like revolts from below about people being angry about certain foreign policy moves. But now, particularly from the right, you have these like anecdotes of people sending the foreign ministry calcium because they think they need more backbone to stand up to folks. And I think even more apparent in the domestic regulatory context in the tech sector in particular, you're seeing once something kind of goes viral, the government is almost taking a reactive stance and sort of trying to, catch up to where the sort of regulating capital or platform companies not doing their fair share for the market or working their employees too hard or whatever. What's your take, Pete, on the dynamic between sort of internet nationalism and the literal wolf, the embodied wolf warrior diplomacy we've seen over the past few years?
Yeah, I think that there's a pretty sort of mutually reinforcing dynamic between the two. As you said, in the 90s and the 2000s, there was this feeling that kind of public opinion had got out ahead of the foreign ministry and was much more nationalistic, had much higher expectations for the role that China was going to play in the world, and that Chinese diplomats were kind of scrambling to keep up. They didn't want to match that incredibly abrasive tone that many internet users urged because they knew it would be damaging for China's international reputation. And at the time, they had cover from the Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao leadership, which on the whole, at least until 2008-9, wanted to kind of cultivate this popular image in the world and improve China's reputation. But that's kind of changed recently, and I think we've kind of seen this like melding of popular nationalist discourse and the way that the government expresses itself. 10 years ago, if you read an editorial in the Global Times or read the rantings of a nationalist on an internet forum in China, that would have seemed incredibly different to the kind of relatively restrained tone of the Chinese foreign ministry. And that's just not true now. I think the Global Times sounds pretty similar to the foreign ministry on your average day. And so I guess that I think of those kind of sentiments as having moved much closer to each other. And it's not, there's still light between them. When the China-India border tensions were kind of at their peak, there were internet users suggesting that foreign ministry officials were being weak and traitors and weren't standing up for the motherland. And so there's still pressure on that front. But I think a lot of it has kind of been solved by, firstly, Xi Jinping's move toward nationalism and the tone that that's helped set for China's foreign relations, but then also the foreign ministry's embrace of wolf warrior diplomacy and just how popular that seems to have been, from T-shirts with Yang Jiechi's nationalist slogans on them through to viral clips and fan sites for senior Chinese diplomats. So yeah, this kind of meeting of minds there between those two forces.
I guess one last question that I would have is whether or not you think we've seen over the last 6 months or so sort of a decline in some of the more, I guess I would say, undisciplined or unhinged social media presence by Chinese sort of foreign diplomatic accounts. I remember sort of I think earlier this year, there's someone in the Irish embassy posted something about a wolf and a lamb and about China not being not being a wolf, but also not being a lamb or something. And I feel like there's been less of that actually in recent months. So maybe they've realized how unprofessional it looks and tightened up on it. Not sure if you have any impressions on that front.
Yeah. So yeah, the Irish embassy tweet you're referring to was a particular kind of classic of its genre. Really, really confoundingly confusing. Anecdotally, I think that there probably has been a tapering of kind of wolf warrior tactics on Twitter. And I know there's a study being done at the moment at University College Dublin on, how far that change has been real, and in particular, how far Xi Jinping's remarks at a Politburo study session over the summer, where he talked about how China needed to cultivate the more lovable image in the world, how far that has kind of influenced the tone. And my impression is probably that some of that has been reduced a little bit. I mean, you still hear statements from senior foreign ministry officials, saying that America is sick and this America's political system is sick. The kind of things that really wouldn't have been at home in the Chinese diplomacy 5, 10, 15 years ago. And so I think that kind of the abrasiveness and the assertiveness has continued. But I think that on that kind of tactical side, especially on social media, things have calmed down a little bit. And that's a tactical decision, but it's also it's a reflection of policy as well, right? Like the two countries are beginning, after a period of great uncertainty at the beginning of the Biden administration, where they were trying to suss each other out, they're starting to hold more regular meetings for senior leaders, have the militaries talk to each other, these kind of things. And I think, from Beijing's perspective, it's not helpful to have diplomats derailing that process. So it's a tactical decision, and it also reflects policy.
Next book?
I don't know. I've been thinking about it a lot. I haven't settled on anything. Yeah, we'll have to see. I don't think it's going to be a kind of Washington.
So what are the contenders?
Sorry.
Oh, come on. It's a podcast. No one listens to the show anyways.
No, I can't do that. They're too half-baked to share. These are at the kind of like singing alone in the shower stage of development. I can't. I guess what I want is another chance to try and put myself in the head of people on the Chinese side. What I really enjoyed about this book was that I spent so much of my time in Beijing listening to the output of the Chinese government that was directed at the public and directed at journalists. And the system does such an incredible job of kind of chiseling out the human idiosyncrasies of the system and presenting this united kind of front toward the outside world, and never showing any daylight or much daylight between officials, and it's very easy in that context to forget that you're dealing with human beings who have kind of emotions and personal agendas. And so I really enjoyed getting my hands on these memoirs and trying as best I could to kind of get inside their heads and explain things from their perspective. And I would love the chance to do that again. I don't know what that looks like, but that's kind of one of the things I'm looking out for, I guess. I want to ask you guys, what do you think I should write next?
I mean, the thing that probably is not going to happen, but I really want to see is some sort of history or it is a history of the MSS and sort of history of like Chinese approaches to intelligence and espionage. Probably too hard to target, but given your sort of current, given sort of your current work on intel, I don't think there is that much existing literature out there in the English language, and I think it's fascinating topics. Everyone knows the MSS exists, but no one really talks about what it actually does.
Yeah, Peter Mattis is the guy who everyone's got to force to write that. There are some memoirs, like if you look at some of Peter's scholarly research in the footnotes, you can see these memoirs that he's gone to, and I imagine that they're infinitely harder to work with than foreign ministry memoirs, but they do exist.
Because Matt Brazil, I think, is actually writing that book, and he'll be back on to discuss it. Because I mean, the trick you can do with the foreign ministry stuff is you can interview the foreign diplomats, right? And then so you can sort of cross-check and bounce back and forth. But I was just going to say do it on the PLA and just interview, what's it like to be a general? Because I'm sure those guys have memoirs too. But it's you run into the same thing, right? You interview the Indian general who fought against the person. You're not going to learn anything about what was in their headspace from that. So it's tricky. I mean, I think this is sort of the book I want to write at some point, is doing this for technology policy and regulators, just because I think it's a little less sensitive and there's more out there, and you can sort of you're not really dealing with state secrets when you're thinking about how to regulate telecommunications or something. So I'm hopeful.
Fun.
But I don't know if these people even write memoirs, because maybe they think their lives are too boring, and they'd be shocked that someone would want to write a book
I would
about
read
them.
it.
But that I think is the direction that I'll maybe go a few years down the road. So in terms of closing outro music, Tianqi Chen went to Nixon in China. His staff had no idea what his response would be, but apparently he thought it was hysterical. All right, this was so much fun. Let's do this again.
Yeah.